The bullet that grazed Kyle Emerson's shoulder in a dusty saloon fight outside Wichita wasn't what made him decide to settle down in Clifton Hill, Arizona territory. But it certainly helped convince him that drifting from town to town with nothing but his horse and his reputation wasn't the life he wanted anymore. He arrived on a scorching afternoon in June of 1883, leading his chestnut mare through streets lined with adobe buildings and wooden storefronts that promised everything from whiskey to salvation. And what caught his eye wasn't the promise of gold or cattle work, but a young woman standing beneath a faded canvas, awning with her arms full of wildflowers that somehow looked more vibrant than anything else in that sun-bleached town. Hannah Thorne had been selling flowers in Clifton Hill for nearly 3 years, ever since her father's copper mine investment had gone bust and left them with nothing but a small piece of land on the edge of town where desert blooms grew stubborn and beautiful despite the harsh climate. She was 22 years old with sun-darkened skin and hands that bore the scars of thorns and hard work, and she had learned that most cowboys who passed through town had no use for flowers, which made them easier to ignore than the ones who lingered with other intentions. Her younger brother Thomas helped her gather the blooms each morning before he went to work at the general store, and her mother took in sewing to help make ends meet while her father drank away his shame at the Lucky Strike saloon. Kyle was 25 and hadn't bought flowers for anyone in his entire life, but something about the way Hannah stood there with such quiet dignity, not calling out to potential customers or putting on false smiles, made him walk his horse directly to her corner instead of heading straight to the boarding house like he had planned. "How much?" he asked, his voice rough from days of riding through dust. Hannah looked up at him with eyes the color of honey in sunlight, and for just a moment he saw surprise flicker across her face before she smoothed it away into polite business courtesy. "Depends on what you want. Wildflowers are a nickel a bunch. The cultivated roses are 15 cents. What's the difference?" He genuinely wanted to know, and that seemed to surprise her even more. "The wildflowers I gather myself from the desert. They don't last as long, but they're honest. The roses I grow in my garden with water I haul myself. They're prettier, I suppose, and they last longer if you treat them right." She said this matter-of-factly, without any attempt at salesmanship. Kyle reached into his pocket and pulled out a quarter. "I'll take the roses." "I'll get you change." She turned toward a small wooden box behind her. "Keep it." He took the roses she handed him, their red petals soft against his calloused fingers. "Who should I give these to?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "That's your business, not mine." "I don't know anyone in this town yet. Just rode in." He stood there holding the flowers, feeling slightly foolish but not quite ready to walk away. Hannah studied him for a long moment, taking in the dust on his clothes, the gun at his hip worn comfortable and easy, the healing wound on his shoulder that showed through a tear in his shirt. "Then why did you buy them?" Seemed like the right thing to do. It was an honest answer, even if he didn't fully understand it himself. Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes. "There's a cemetery at the edge of town. People always need flowers there." Kyle nodded slowly. "Much obliged for the suggestion." He tipped his hat to her and led his horse away, but he could feel her watching him as he went. He didn't go to the cemetery. Instead, he took the roses to the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who nearly dropped her dish towel when he presented them to her while asking about a room. She gave him her best room at a discount, and told everyone who would listen about the polite cowboy with the thoughtful gesture, which meant that by the time Kyle walked into the Lucky Strike that evening, looking for a meal and information about work, half the town had already formed an opinion about him. The saloon was busy for a weeknight, filled with miners and ranch hands spending their wages on whiskey and cards. Kyle found a spot at the bar and ordered stew and coffee, ignoring the curious glances sent his way. The bartender was a heavy-set man with impressive mustaches who introduced himself as Dutch Miller. "You're the one who bought flowers off Hannah Thorne," Dutch said, and it wasn't quite a question. "That a problem?" Kyle kept his tone neutral. "Not at all, just unusual. Most cowboys who notice Hannah aren't interested in her flowers, if you catch my meaning, and she's had to set more than a few straight about her being a respectable woman." Dutch slid the bowl of stew across the bar. "Her daddy's over there in the corner, drinking himself into an early grave." Kyle glanced over and saw a man in his 50s slumped over a table, staring into an empty glass with the hollow eyes of someone who had given up on everything including himself. Hard times, of his own making mostly. Richard Thorne came here 5 years ago convinced he was going to strike it rich in copper. Invested everything he had and everything he could borrow into a mine that produced nothing but debt. His wife and daughter work themselves to the bone while he sits here feeling sorry for himself. Dutch shook his head. "Hannah's a good girl, deserves better than she's got." Kyle ate his stew and filed the information away. He wasn't looking to get involved in anyone's family troubles, but he couldn't quite shake the image of Hannah standing in the sun with her arms full of flowers, working hard while her father surrendered to whiskey. The next morning, Kyle found work at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles outside of town, owned by a tough-minded woman named Rebecca Ross, who had taken over when her husband died and ran the operation better than he ever had. The work was honest and hard, breaking horses and mending fences and moving cattle, and Kyle was good at it. He found a rhythm in the days, rising before dawn and returning to town as the sun set, his body aching in the good way that came from useful labor. Every Saturday, he bought flowers from Hannah. He never missed a week, even when he was so tired he could barely stay in the saddle for the ride back to town. Sometimes he bought the wildflowers, sometimes the roses, and he always told her to keep the change even though she always offered to get it for him. He gave the flowers to different people around town. The school teacher who had lost her husband the previous winter, the old man who sat outside the general store carving wood, the young mother whose baby had been sick with fever. Clifton Hill was small enough that everyone knew what he was doing, and Hannah had to know too, but neither of them spoke about it directly. They talked, though, in brief exchanges that grew gradually longer each week. Hannah learned that Kyle had been raised on a ranch in Texas, that his parents had died when he was 17, that he had spent the last 8 years moving from place to place because he had never found a reason to stay anywhere. Kyle learned that Hannah had once dreamed of being a teacher, that she loved the desert mornings when the world was cool and quiet, that she missed her older sister who had married a merchant and moved to California before their father's fortune collapsed. "You ever think about leaving?" Kyle asked her one Saturday in late August, taking the bunch of wildflowers she offered. The heat was oppressive, and sweat dampened the collar of her simple cotton dress. "Every day," Hannah admitted, "but Thomas is only 16 and my mother needs help and my father, well." She shrugged, a gesture that held resignation and frustration and loyalty all tangled together. "This is where I'm needed." "That's admirable," Kyle said and meant it. "That's one word for it." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Most people would say I'm foolish for staying when there's nothing here for me. You've got your flowers. You've built something, even in hard circumstances. That takes strength." Hannah looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, and Kyle felt something shift between them, some acknowledgement of a connection that had been building through all these weeks of brief conversations and careful courtesy. "Why do you keep buying them?" she asked quietly. "The flowers." "Every week, without fail." Kyle had asked himself the same question more times than he could count, and he still wasn't entirely sure of the answer, or at least not sure he was ready to speak it aloud. "Maybe I'm hoping that if I keep doing something beautiful, something good, I'll become someone worthy of beauty and goodness." "You're already that," Hannah said, so softly he almost didn't hear her. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted down the street. 3 men on horseback were riding hard toward the saloon, whooping and firing their pistols into the air. Kyle instinctively stepped in front of Hannah, his hand moving to his gun, but the riders weren't attacking, just drunk and reckless. They dismounted sloppily and staggered into the Lucky Strike, leaving their horses stamping nervously in the street. "It's getting worse," Hannah said, her voice tight. "The miners are angry because the wages dropped again, and the ranch hands are angry because there's not enough work and everyone's drinking too much and looking for fights." "Has anyone bothered you?" Kyle's jaw was set hard. "Not yet, but I hear things. Dutch looks out for me when I'm nearby, and Thomas walks me home most evenings." She touched his arm lightly, just for a second. "You should be careful, too. Some of the men around here don't like that you give your money to me for flowers instead of spending it on whiskey and gambling like they do. They think it makes them look bad. Let them think what they want." But Kyle appreciated her concern, appreciated that she worried about him. That night, the fight came looking for him anyway. 3 of the men from the Lucky Strike cornered him behind the boarding house, accusing him of putting on airs and thinking he was better than everyone else. Kyle tried to talk them down, but they were drunk and spoiling for violence, and when the first punch was thrown, he defended himself efficiently and without mercy. 2 of them ended up unconscious in the dirt, and the third ran off holding his broken nose. Marshal Tom Gibson arrived too late to stop the fight, but in time to hear testimony from witnesses, who confirmed that Kyle had been attacked first. The marshal was a fair man in his 40s who had kept the peace in Clifton Hill for nearly a decade through a combination of good judgment and the willingness to be hard when necessary. "You handled yourself well," Gibson told Kyle as they stood over the groaning men. "But you've made enemies now." "Watch your back. I always do." Kyle flexed his bruised knuckles. "You're the one who buys flowers from Hannah Thorne." The marshal said it casually, but Kyle sensed an underlying purpose. "Every Saturday. She's good people. Her whole family is, even her father despite his current state. They don't deserve the hand they've been dealt." Gibson looked at Kyle directly. "I'm glad someone's looking out for her, even in a small way." The next Saturday, when Kyle approached Hannah's flower stand, she was arguing with a man in an expensive suit who had the look of an Eastern businessman trying to make his fortune in the West. Her face was flushed with anger, and her hands were clenched at her sides. "I said no, Mr. Crawford. The land isn't for sale." Hannah's voice was firm, but Kyle could hear the tremor underneath. "Your father seems to think differently." Crawford's tone was oily with false sympathy. "He owes significant debts around town, Miss Thorne, and my offer would clear all of them with money left over for your family to make a fresh start. My father doesn't own that land. My mother does. Her brother left it to her before he died, and she's been clear that it stays in the family." Hannah lifted her chin defiantly. Crawford's expression hardened. "I'm trying to be generous, Miss Thorne, but there are other ways to acquire property from people who can't afford to keep it. The bank holds a note on your father's debts, and I have connections there. Perhaps you should reconsider before this becomes unpleasant." Kyle stepped forward, positioning himself beside Hannah. "The lady said no. Seems pretty clear to me." Crawford looked him up and down with obvious disdain. This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. You're bothering a friend of mine. That makes it my concern. Kyle, you don't have to. Hannah touched his arm, but he could hear the relief in her voice. I know I don't have to. He kept his eyes on Crawford. But I'm going to stand here anyway until this conversation is over. Crawford sneered at both of them but backed away. This isn't finished. You can't grow flowers forever on land that's valuable for mining. Economics will win in the end, one way or another. He walked away with stiff-backed indignation. Hannah let out a shaky breath. Thank you. He's been coming around for weeks, getting more insistent each time. What's so special about your land? Kyle asked. Nothing, as far as I know. It's just a few acres of rocky soil where somehow flowers grow better than they should. But Crawford is convinced there's copper there, or silver, or something worth digging up. She looked exhausted suddenly, the weight of constant worry showing in her face. My father would sell in a heartbeat for enough money to pay his debts and buy more whiskey. He doesn't care that it's the only thing keeping us from complete destitution. Your mother really owns it. Yes, thank God. But Crawford's not wrong about the debts. If the bank decides to call them in and my father can't pay, they could force us to sell everything, including land that's in my mother's name if they claim it was used as collateral. Hannah's hands trembled slightly as she straightened the flowers in their buckets. I'm scared, Kyle. I don't know how much longer we can hold on. Kyle made a decision that had been forming in the back of his mind for weeks without him fully acknowledging it. How much does your father owe? Around $300, last I heard. Might be more now. The sum was clearly astronomical to her. I've got savings. Been putting away my wages since I got here, and I didn't spend much before that either. Kyle had nearly $400 hidden in his room at the boarding house, the accumulation of 8 years of work with nothing to spend it on. I could help. Hannah's eyes went wide. No, absolutely not. I can't take your money, Kyle. That's not why I told you about this. I know it's not. But I'm offering anyway. He could see her wanting to refuse, wanting to maintain her pride and independence, and he understood that. Not as charity, as an investment. You could pay me back over time, or I could become a partner in your flower business, or whatever arrangement feels right to you. But don't let Crawford and the bank take your land because of money when there's money available. Why would you do this? Hannah's voice was almost a whisper. You barely know me. Kyle had known this question was coming, and had tried to prepare an answer that wouldn't reveal too much of what he was feeling. But standing there looking into her eyes, he found he couldn't lie or soften the truth. I know you well enough to see that you're honest and hardworking and kind. I know you take care of your family even when it costs you your dreams. I know that when you talk about your flowers, your whole face lights up like sunrise. And I know that every Saturday for the past 3 months, the best part of my week has been these few minutes talking to you. Hannah's breath caught, and color rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat. Kyle, you don't have to feel the same way, he continued. This offer isn't conditional on anything except me wanting to help someone who deserves help. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't hope that maybe, eventually, you might see me as more than just a customer who buys flowers. For a long moment, Hannah just looked at him, and Kyle could see a dozen emotions playing across her face. Surprise, fear, hope, caution, and something that might have been the same feeling that had been growing in his chest for weeks now. I already do, she finally said. See you as more than a customer, I mean. I look forward to Saturdays too. I think about things I want to tell you during the week. I notice when you're tired or hurt, and I worry about you. Then let me help, please. Kyle took her hand, the first time they had really touched beyond accidental brushes, and her fingers were warm and strong in his. Let me do this for you, for your family. Hannah looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, and he saw the moment she decided to trust him. "All right, but as a loan with interest, and I'll pay you back every penny even if it takes years. Whatever terms you want." Kyle would have agreed to anything in that moment. They worked out the details over the next few days, meeting in the evening after Kyle returned from the ranch, and Hannah closed her flower stand. They sat on the porch of the boarding house where Mrs. Patterson could see them and propriety was maintained, and they talked about more than just money and debts. They talked about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Kyle learned that Hannah had taught herself to read and write by borrowing books from the schoolteacher, that her favorite time of day was early morning when she walked into the desert to gather wildflowers and the world was still cool and quiet, that she had a beautiful singing voice, but only sang when she thought no one could hear her. Hannah learned that Kyle had been in love once before when he was 19 with a girl who chose someone richer and more settled, that he was good at carving wood, and sometimes made small animals to leave for children around town, that he had a deep loneliness inside him that came from years of drifting without purpose or connection. They discovered they both loved thunderstorms and hated dishonesty, that they both believed in working hard and treating people fairly, that they both wanted something more than just survival from life. On a Tuesday evening in September, Kyle went to the bank with Hannah and her mother, a quiet woman named Martha who looked 10 years older than she was from worry and hardship. They paid off Richard Thorne's debts in full, and the relief on Martha's face was worth every penny to Kyle. The bank manager was clearly disappointed to lose the leverage he had been preparing to use, but the money was good, and the debts were cleared, leaving the Thorne family free of that particular burden. Richard Thorne's reaction was not gratitude but anger that he had not been consulted, that decisions had been made about his debts without his input. He confronted Kyle in the street outside the saloon, drunk and belligerent, accusing him of trying to buy his daughter like property. "I'm not trying to buy anyone," Kyle said evenly, keeping his temper in check though it was a near thing. "I loaned money to your wife and daughter to help your family. What happens next is entirely up to Hannah. You think you're better than me, coming in here with your money and your flowers and your noble gestures." Richard swayed on his feet, his face red with drink and rage. "I think I'm someone who saw people struggling and had the means to help. That's all." Kyle tried to step around him, but Richard grabbed his arm. "Stay away from my daughter. We don't need your charity or your judgment." Hannah appeared then, her face set with determination. "That's enough, Father. Kyle helped us when you couldn't help yourself, when you wouldn't help yourself. You should be grateful, but if you can't manage that, at least have the decency to be silent. Don't you talk to me that way." Richard's voice was dangerous now. "I'll talk to you however I need to. I've watched you drink yourself into uselessness while Mother and I work ourselves to exhaustion. I've watched you feel sorry for yourself instead of trying to fix what you broke. I've been respectful and patient because you're my father, but I'm done pretending your behavior is acceptable." Hannah's voice shook but held firm. "Go back to your whiskey, Father. It's clearly more important to you than your family." Richard raised his hand as if to strike her, and Kyle moved faster than thought, catching the man's wrist in an iron grip. "Don't," he said quietly, but there was steel beneath the word. "Don't even think about it." For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in tableau, and then Richard jerked his arm free and stumbled back toward the saloon without another word. Kyle watched him go, then turned to Hannah, who was trembling with anger and hurt. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I've wanted to say that to him for 3 years." Hannah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I just never had the courage before. You've got more courage than anyone I know." Kyle wanted to pull her into his arms but was aware of the people watching from windows and doorways. "Come on. Let me walk you home." They walked through the dusty streets as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the desert on fire. Hannah's house was small and weathered but scrupulously maintained, with a garden plot where she grew her roses and marigolds and zinnias. Thomas was sitting on the porch, and he stood when he saw them approach. "I heard what happened with Father," he said, looking at Kyle with an expression that mixed gratitude and caution. "Thank you for helping Hannah, for helping all of us. Your sister doesn't need much help. She's pretty capable on her own." Kyle smiled at Hannah, who managed a small smile in return. "I'm glad you think so." Thomas was 17 now and tall for his age, with the same honey-colored eyes as his sister. "But she's been carrying this family alone for too long. It's good she's got someone else in her corner." Martha came out then and invited Kyle to stay for supper, and though he could see the exhaustion in her face, the invitation was genuine. They ate simple food, beans and cornbread and coffee that was more chicory than actual coffee, but the conversation was warm and real. Martha told stories about Hannah and Thomas as children, making them both blush with embarrassment and laugh at the memories. Kyle shared some of his own childhood stories from the ranch in Texas, carefully editing out the harder parts. After dinner, Kyle helped Thomas carry water from the well for Hannah's garden while she and Martha cleaned up inside. The younger man worked silently for a few minutes, then spoke without looking at Kyle. "My sister's falling in love with you. You know that, right?" Kyle nearly dropped the bucket he was carrying. "I hoped, but I wasn't certain. I am. I know her better than anyone, and I can see it." Thomas finally met his eyes. "So I need to know if you're serious about her, or if you're just passing through like every other cowboy who's ever rolled into this town." "I'm serious." Kyle set down the bucket and met Thomas's gaze directly. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. I know it hasn't been very long, but I care about Hannah more than I knew it was possible to care about someone. I want to build a life here with her if she'll have me." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Because if you hurt her, I'll find a way to make you regret it, even if you are bigger and better with a gun than I am." "I'd expect nothing less." Kyle respected the fierce loyalty in the young man's voice. "You're a good brother. I try. She's sacrificed a lot for me, for all of us. She deserves to be happy." Thomas picked up his bucket and headed toward the garden. "Come on, these roses won't water themselves." As September turned to October, Kyle and Hannah's relationship deepened in the slow, careful way of two people who had both been hurt before and were determined not to rush into something they weren't ready for. They took walks in the evening when Kyle returned from the ranch, exploring the desert paths that Hannah knew like her own heartbeat. She showed him where the best wildflowers grew, taught him the names of the plants that could survive in this harsh climate, shared her knowledge of which blooms lasted longest and which ones were too delicate for anything but immediate enjoyment. Kyle showed her the small carvings he made in the evenings at the boarding house. A horse, a bird, a flower that he had shaped thinking of her. Hannah treasured each one, lining them up on the windowsill in her bedroom where they caught the morning light. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's rhythms and silences, discovering the comfortable ease that came with genuine compatibility. Their first kiss happened on a Sunday afternoon in late October, after church services that Kyle had started attending because he knew Hannah would be there. They had walked out to the edge of town where the desert stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, and Hannah had been telling him about her dream of one day having a real flower shop, not just a stand on the street corner, but an actual building with glass windows and proper displays. "You could do it," Kyle said. "You could have all of that. It seems impossible." Hannah looked out at the horizon. "It would take so much money, and even with the debt paid off, we're still just scraping by. Not impossible, difficult maybe, but not impossible. Especially if you had a partner to help." Kyle moved closer to her, their shoulders almost touching. "Someone who believed in your dream and wanted to help make it real." Hannah turned to look at him, and the hope in her eyes was almost painful to see. "Are you offering to be that partner? In business and in everything else, if you want me?" Kyle's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I love you, Hannah. I've been in love with you since the first time you told me about the difference between wildflowers and cultivated roses. I want to build a life with you, whatever shape that life takes. I love you too." Hannah's voice was soft but certain. "I think I started falling for you the first day you bought flowers and didn't even know who to give them to, and I've been falling more every day since." Kyle cupped her face gently in his hands, giving her every chance to pull away, but instead she leaned into him as he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet and tasted like the future, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "I want to marry you," Kyle said, because there was no point in hiding his intentions. "Not today, not even necessarily soon, but eventually, when you're ready. I want to wake up next to you every morning and work beside you every day and build something good and lasting together. Yes." Hannah laughed, the sound full of joy. "Yes to all of it. Maybe not immediately, because we should probably court properly so my mother doesn't think I've lost my mind, but yes, I want all of that too." They courted properly, though everyone in town knew it was just a formality before the inevitable wedding. Kyle had dinner with the Thorne family twice a week and escorted Hannah to church every Sunday. He bought flowers from her every Saturday without fail, and now when he gave them away around town, he did it with Hannah beside him, the two of them becoming a familiar sight as they brought small touches of beauty to people's lives. Rebecca Ross gave Kyle a raise and more responsibility at the ranch, telling him frankly that she could see he was planning to settle down and wanted to make sure he had the means to support a wife properly. Marshall Gibson made a point of mentioning that the town could use another deputy if Kyle was interested in additional work. Dutch at the Lucky Strike started setting aside the best cuts of meat when Kyle came in for meals, refusing to accept extra payment and saying only that a man who bought flowers every week for his sweetheart deserved a good steak now and then. Not everyone was happy about their relationship. Crawford made several more attempts to pressure the Thornes into selling their land, and when that didn't work, he tried to convince other merchants in town not to do business with them. A few of the men who had been drunk and angry that night behind the boarding house continued to make trouble when they could, spreading rumors that Kyle was after Hannah's land himself, that he was no better than Crawford, just smoother about it. Hannah faced these rumors head-on, defending Kyle publicly and making it clear that anyone who insulted him was insulting her as well. Martha Thorne proved to be a surprisingly fierce ally, putting down gossip with a sharp tongue and reminding people exactly how Kyle had helped their family with no expectation of return. Even Richard, who had maintained a sullen distance from Kyle, eventually admitted grudgingly that the cowboy had done right by his daughter, which was about as close to approval as anyone expected him to get. In December, a cold snap brought rare snow to Clifton Hill, transforming the desert into something magical and strange. Kyle and Hannah walked through the transformed landscape, their breath misting in the frigid air, and Hannah talked about how the snow would be good for her roses, giving them the dormancy they needed to bloom even more beautifully in the spring. "I've been thinking," Kyle said as they stood watching the sun set over snow-covered cacti, "about your flower shop. What if we started making it real?" "What do you mean?" Hannah's eyes were bright with interest. "I've been talking to Mrs. Patterson. She owns that empty building next to the boarding house. Used to be a dress shop before the previous tenant moved to Phoenix. She's willing to rent it to us at a reasonable price, and she said if we fix it up ourselves, she'll take that off the first few months' rent." Kyle pulled Hannah closer against the cold. "We could work on it together, make it exactly what you want. Open in the spring when the flowers are at their best." "Kyle, that's wonderful, but I don't know if I can afford rent on a building, even a reasonable rent." Hannah's excitement was tempered with realistic caution. "You're not alone anymore. We'd be partners, remember? I can help cover the rent until the business is established enough to support itself." He turned her to face him. "I believe in this, Hannah. I believe in you. Let me help you make this dream real." Hannah threw her arms around his neck, and Kyle lifted her right off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed with pure, unfiltered joy. When he set her down, she kissed him thoroughly, not caring that they were visible from town or that it was probably not entirely proper. "Thank you," she said when they finally broke apart. "Thank you for believing in me, for seeing what I could be instead of just what I am." "I see what you are just fine." Kyle touched his forehead to hers. "You're the strongest, most amazing woman I've ever known. This flower shop is just going to make that obvious to everyone else." They started working on the building the next week, spending every spare moment cleaning, repairing, and transforming the dusty, empty space into something beautiful. Thomas helped after his shifts at the general store, proving to be surprisingly skilled with carpentry. Rebecca Ross donated some old lumber from the ranch that was too good to burn but not needed for anything specific. Dutch contributed paint that had been sitting in his storeroom for years, saying he had no use for the cheerful yellow and soft green, but thought they might work well for a flower shop. The whole town seemed to catch the enthusiasm of the project. The school teacher brought her students by to help clean windows. The blacksmith made decorative brackets for hanging baskets without charging for his labor. Even Marshall Gibson showed up one Sunday with his tools and spent the afternoon helping reinforce the shelving. It became a community effort, everyone contributing what they could, and Kyle realized that Hannah had touched more lives with her flowers and her quiet kindness than either of them had fully understood. Crawford watched the progress with obvious displeasure, and in January, he made one final attempt to get what he wanted. He went to Richard Thorne with an offer, enough money to clear out completely and start fresh somewhere else, with the stipulation that Richard convince his wife to sign over the land as part of the deal. Richard, to his credit and everyone's surprise, said no. "I've been a sorry excuse for a husband and father," Richard told Martha that evening, with Kyle and Hannah there as witnesses. "I've let you down in every way a man can let his family down. But I'm not going to make it worse by selling your land out from under you, even if Crawford's offering enough to solve all our problems." Martha looked at her husband with an expression that held equal parts surprise and cautious hope. "What changed your mind?" "Watching that cowboy treat my daughter better than I've ever treated any of you." Richard looked at Kyle, his eyes red-rimmed but clear for once. "I've been drinking in the Lucky Strike every night for 3 years, watching Kyle come in and order food instead of whiskey, watching him work hard and save his money and treat people with respect. And then watching him give that money to help my family, not because he wanted anything from us, but because it was the right thing to do, made me ashamed of what I'd become. Father." Hannah's voice was soft. "I'm not saying I'm suddenly going to be perfect. I've got a long way to go before I make up for what I've done if I ever can, but I'm going to try." Richard straightened his shoulders. "I've been talking to Gibson about helping out at the jail, doing cleaning and maintenance work. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work, and he's willing to give me a chance. And I've been attending the temperance meetings at the church." The change in Richard didn't happen overnight. He had setbacks, days when the temptation of whiskey was stronger than his resolve. But he kept trying with a determination that reminded everyone that the man who had once been ambitious and driven enough to move his family west in search of opportunity was still there underneath the disappointment and shame. Martha began to soften toward him, cautiously rebuilding trust that had been shattered. The whole family began to heal, slowly but genuinely. The flower shop opened on the first day of April in 1884, with bunting and ribbons and half the town turning out for the celebration. Hannah had worked herself nearly to exhaustion getting everything perfect. Displays of roses and wildflowers, dried arrangements, seeds for people to grow their own gardens, and even a few exotic blooms that she had ordered from California as a special treat. Kyle had built beautiful wooden stands and shelves that showed off the flowers to their best advantage, and the windows that he and Thomas had cleaned until they sparkled, now let in perfect light. Thorne's Flower Shop. The sign above the door proclaimed in elegant gold letters that had cost more than Kyle wanted to admit, but had been worth every penny to see Hannah's face when she first saw them. Rebecca Ross bought an enormous arrangement for the ranch house. Dutch bought flowers for all the tables at the Lucky Strike, claiming they would class up the place. The school teacher brought her entire class to learn about different types of flowers and how they grew. By the end of the first day, Hannah had sold more flowers than she typically sold in a month at her street corner stand, and the cash box was satisfyingly heavy. "We did it," she said that evening after they had closed up and counted the receipts. "We actually did it. You did it." Kyle pulled her close. "I just helped. We did it together." Hannah corrected him. "That's the important part, together." Kyle had been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And standing in the flower shop they had built together with Hannah smiling up at him with joy and pride and love. He knew this was it. "Hannah Thorne," he said, pulling the ring out and taking her hand. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Hannah's eyes went wide and tears immediately started streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." Kyle slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. They kissed surrounded by flowers and the smell of earth and growth, and Kyle felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't even realized was restless, a sense of home and rightness, and belonging that he had been searching for his entire adult life. They were married in June at the little church on the edge of town, with half of Clifton Hill in attendance. Hannah wore a dress that her mother and the schoolteacher had sewn together, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers and roses mixed together. Kyle wore his best suit, brushed and cleaned until it looked almost new, and he couldn't stop smiling as he watched Hannah walk up the aisle on her father's arm. Richard had been sober for 4 months and working steadily at the jail, and the pride on his face as he handed his daughter over to Kyle was genuine and hard-won. Martha cried happy tears in the front pew. Thomas served as Kyle's best man, having become as close as a brother over the past year. Rebecca Ross and Marshall Gibson sat together, and Dutch had closed the Lucky Strike for the afternoon so he could attend, something he claimed he had never done before in 15 years of running the place. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, with vows spoken in voices that shook with emotion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kyle kissed Hannah like he was sealing a promise that would last for the rest of their lives, and everyone cheered and applauded. The reception was held at the boarding house, with food contributed by seemingly everyone in town. Roasted meat and fresh bread, pies and cakes, and enough coffee to keep the celebration going well into the evening. Kyle and Hannah danced to fiddle music in the street, their first dance as husband and wife, and then everyone else joined in until the impromptu party had taken over the entire block. Children ran between the dancers, shrieking with laughter. Old-timers told stories about weddings they had attended over the years. The whole town came together in celebration, and for one perfect evening, all the hardship and struggle that came with life in the Arizona Territory seemed distant and unimportant. Kyle had rented a small house on the edge of town, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it had a yard where Hannah could grow flowers, and it was theirs. He carried her over the threshold that night, both of them laughing and kissing, and they made love for the first time as husband and wife with moonlight streaming through the windows and the scent of roses drifting in from the garden. "I never thought I could be this happy," Hannah whispered afterward, lying in Kyle's arms with her head on his chest. "I spent so long just trying to survive, just trying to keep my family from falling apart completely. I forgot that life could be about more than just endurance." "You're going to have more than endurance for the rest of your life," Kyle promised, kissing her forehead. "You're going to have joy and success and love and everything else you deserve." The flower shop thrived beyond their most optimistic projections. Hannah had a gift for knowing exactly what people wanted before they even asked, and she expanded the business to include gardening supplies, landscaping services, and even teaching classes on flower arrangement and garden cultivation. Kyle continued working at the ranch, but gradually took on more responsibility at the shop, discovering that he enjoyed the business side of things and was good at it. They worked side by side every day, learning the rhythms of partnership both in business and in marriage. They had disagreements, of course, about everything from how to arrange the displays to whether they should expand into the empty space next door. But they learned how to talk through their differences with respect and love. They supported each other through difficult days and celebrated each other's victories, and the bond between them deepened into something that felt unbreakable. In the spring of 1885, Hannah discovered she was pregnant. She told Kyle one morning while they were opening the shop, just blurted it out in the middle of their routine, and he was so startled he dropped the vase he was holding. It shattered on the floor, water and roses spilling everywhere, but neither of them cared. Kyle picked Hannah up and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "We're going to have a baby," Hannah said, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "We're going to have a baby," Kyle repeated, and the wonder in his voice matched hers perfectly. The pregnancy was difficult at times, with Hannah sick most mornings and exhausted by early afternoon, but she refused to slow down or let Kyle coddle her too much. She worked in the shop right up until the week before the baby was due, rearranging displays and helping customers and teaching her gardening classes. Kyle worried constantly, hovering and fretting until Hannah finally told him firmly that she was growing a human being, not dying, and he needed to calm down before he drove them both crazy. Their son was born on a cold November morning, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected, and in such a hurry that the doctor barely made it in time. Kyle held Hannah's hand through the whole ordeal, white-knuckled and terrified, whispering encouragement and love while she screamed and pushed and did the hardest work he had ever witnessed. When the baby finally emerged, red and wrinkled and wailing with impressive lungs, Kyle wept openly with relief and joy. They named him James after Kyle's father, and from the moment he drew his first breath, He became the center of their world. Kyle had never imagined he could love anyone as much as he loved Hannah, but the fierce protective adoration he felt for his tiny son expanded his heart in ways he hadn't known were possible. Hannah nursed the baby and sang to him in her beautiful voice, and Kyle walked the floor with him when he couldn't sleep, talking to him about everything and nothing, making promises about the life they would give him and the man they would help him become. The shop had to adjust around the new addition to their family. Hannah brought James with her every day, setting up a cradle behind the counter where she could watch him while she worked. Customers cooed over the baby and brought gifts. Hand-knitted blankets, carved toys, offers to watch him if Hannah and Kyle needed a few hours to themselves. The whole town seemed invested in James's well-being, and Kyle understood that this was what community meant, this network of care and support that extended beyond just blood family. Richard Thorne was a surprisingly attentive grandfather, sober now for over a year and working steadily. He would stop by the shop to hold James, talking to his grandson about all the mistakes he had made and how he was trying to do better, how he wanted to be someone the boy could be proud of when he was old enough to understand. Martha made clothes for the baby with skill and love, and Thomas taught his nephew silly songs that made him giggle and wave his tiny fists. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and small victories and steady growth. The flower shop expanded into the space next door, just as they had debated, allowing them to offer even more variety and services. Hannah hired 2 part-time employees, young women from town who wanted to learn the trade, and she taught them with patience and generosity. Kyle took over most of the business management, handling accounts and ordering and negotiations with suppliers, discovering that he had a talent for numbers and logistics that he had never had the opportunity to develop before. They had a daughter in 1887, a tiny thing with Hannah's honey-colored eyes and Kyle's dark hair, and they named her Rose because it seemed fitting given how they had met and what they had built together. James was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her constantly and bring her flowers from the shop until their house was filled with blooms in various states of wilting. Rose was an easier baby than James had been, content to sleep and eat and observe the world with solemn attention. Clifton Hill continued to grow around them, transforming from a rough mining town into something more settled and civilized. The railroad came through in 1888, bringing more people and more opportunity. New businesses opened, and old ones expanded. The school got a new building, and the church added a bell tower. Marshal Gibson finally retired, and his deputy took over, keeping the peace with the same fair-minded determination that Gibson had modeled. Crawford eventually gave up on trying to acquire the Thorne land and moved on to other schemes in other towns. The lucky strike changed hands when Dutch decided to retire to California, but the new owner kept the name and maintained the tradition of buying fresh flowers for the tables every week from Thorne's flower shop. Rebecca Ross sold the Double R Ranch to a younger couple but stayed in town, becoming a regular customer and a good friend to both Kyle and Hannah. In 1890, Richard Thorne died quietly in his sleep, sober and at peace, having made what amends he could for the years he had lost to whiskey and despair. His funeral was well attended, and people spoke kindly of the man he had been in his final years, rather than the man he had been at his lowest point. Martha grieved, but without the bitter edge that might have been there if Richard had died before making his changes, and she moved in with Kyle and Hannah, helping with the children and the shop, and becoming an integral part of their daily lives. Thomas married a schoolteacher from Phoenix in 1891, bringing her back to Clifton Hill, where he had taken over the general store from its retiring owner. Kyle and Hannah stood up with them at their wedding, and Hannah cried as she watched her little brother make his vows, so proud of the man he had become. Thomas and his wife had twins the following year, and James and Rose gained cousins to play with and drive their parents crazy with their elaborate games and schemes. The flower shop became an institution in Clifton Hill, the place people went not just for flowers but for advice, comfort, and connection. Hannah had a gift for knowing when someone needed to talk, and she listened without judgment while arranging bouquets or teaching gardening techniques. Kyle became known as someone who could be trusted with problems both practical and personal, offering solutions when he could and simple support when solutions weren't possible. Together, they created a space that was about more than just commerce, a place where community was built one conversation at a time. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kyle gave Hannah a locket with tiny portraits of James and Rose inside. Hannah gave Kyle a leather journal filled with pressed flowers, one from every week of their marriage, starting with the very first roses he had bought from her back when she was selling them from a street corner, and he was just a drifter looking for something he couldn't quite name. "I saved them all," she told him as he paged through the journal with wonder. "Every single flower you ever bought from me. I pressed them and dated them and wrote notes about what we talked about that day, what was happening in our lives. I wanted to remember every step of how we got here." Kyle couldn't speak for a moment, overcome with emotion at the thoughtfulness of the gift and what it represented. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," he finally managed. "Thank you for remembering. Thank you for seeing even back then that what we had was worth preserving." "I knew from the very beginning that you were special," Hannah said softly. "That very first day when you bought roses and didn't know who to give them to, I knew you were different from every other man who had ever passed through this town. I just didn't know yet how different, how much you were going to change my life." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that had never faded. And afterward, they lay tangled together talking about everything they had built and everything they still wanted to do. Hannah wanted to write a book about desert gardening, sharing the knowledge she had accumulated over the years. Kyle wanted to expand their business into wholesale, supplying flowers to shops and hotels throughout the territory. They both wanted to travel someday, to see the ocean and the mountains and all the places they had only read about in books. But more than any of those dreams, they wanted to keep doing exactly what they were doing. Working together, raising their children, being part of their community, loving each other through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a life. The grand ambitions that had driven Kyle in his younger years, the restless need to prove himself and find his place in the world, had been replaced by deep satisfaction in the life he had built with Hannah, the family they had created, the roots they had put down in this dusty Arizona town. In 1895, on a Saturday morning that felt like any other, Kyle bought flowers from Hannah in the shop they now owned together. It was a ritual they had maintained even after marriage, even after children, even after a decade of partnership and love. Every Saturday, Kyle would formally purchase a bouquet, and they would smile at each other with the memory of how this simple transaction had changed both their lives. "Who are these for?" Hannah asked, the same question she had asked that very first day. "For you," Kyle said, handing her the roses. "They've always been for you from the very first day. I just didn't know it yet." Hannah took the flowers with tears in her eyes, even though she had heard variations of this answer 100 times before. "I love you. I love you too. More than flowers, more than this shop, more than anything in this world except those two kids running around upstairs making more noise than should be humanly possible." Kyle pulled her close, breathing in the scent of roses that always clung to her hair and skin. James came thundering down the stairs then, 9 years old and all energy and enthusiasm, with Rose right behind him trying to keep up with her brother the way she always did. They crashed into their parents, demanding breakfast and attention and mediation for whatever argument they were currently having about whose turn it was to help in the shop. Martha appeared in the doorway, shaking her head with fond exasperation at her grandchildren's chaos. Kyle looked around at his family, at the shop full of flowers that he and Hannah had built from nothing but hope and hard work, at the town visible through the windows where they had made a life and a home, and he felt complete in a way he had never imagined possible. This was what he had been searching for during all those years of drifting. This sense of purpose and belonging and love that made every day worth living and every challenge worth facing. The cowboy who had bought flowers every week, not knowing who to give them to, had finally found the answer he had been looking for all along. He gave them to the woman who sold them, and she gave him back everything he had never known he needed: a home, a family, a future, and a love that would last for all the years to come. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. James grew into a young man who inherited his mother's gift with flowers and his father's head for business, taking over more responsibilities at the shop as he got older. Rose developed a passion for painting, creating beautiful watercolors of desert blooms that Hannah sold in the shop alongside the actual flowers. Martha lived to see both her grandchildren grown, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1899, surrounded by family. Thomas and his wife had more children, filling Clifton Hill with the next generation of Thornes and creating a tight-knit extended family that gathered for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, and all the ordinary moments in between. The cousins grew up together, as close as siblings, creating memories and traditions that would shape their own futures. Kyle and Hannah grew older together, their hair graying and their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. They took that trip to the ocean eventually, standing hand in hand on the California coast and marveling at the vastness of the water. They saw mountains and forests and cities, but they always came home to Clifton Hill, to the flower shop that remained the center of their world. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the town threw them a celebration in the street, hanging bunting and bringing food and dancing to fiddle music, just like they had at the wedding all those years ago. James gave a speech about how his parents had taught him that love was about showing up every day and doing the work, and never taking each other for granted. Rose painted a portrait of Kyle and Hannah standing in front of the flower shop, capturing not just their faces but the way they looked at each other, the tenderness and respect and deep affection that had only grown stronger over the years. 25 years, Hannah said that night as they lay in bed in the house that had expanded and improved along with their fortunes, but remained fundamentally the same home they had started in. Can you believe it's been that long? Some days it feels like forever, and some days it feels like we just met. Kyle pulled her close, fitting together the way they always had. But every day has been worth it. Even the hard ones, even the ones where we wanted to strangle each other, every single day has been worth it because I got to spend it with you, sweet talker. But Hannah was smiling. You know what I was thinking about today? That first Saturday when you bought roses and didn't know who to give them to. What would have happened if you had just walked away? If you had never come back? I would have come back. Kyle said it with absolute certainty. Maybe not the next week. Maybe I would have tried to stay away because I was scared of what I was feeling. But eventually I would have come back. You were already under my skin, even from that first conversation. I wouldn't have been able to stay away. I'm glad you didn't try. Hannah kissed him softly. "I'm glad you kept coming back, week after week, until you finally gave me those flowers and told me how you felt. Best thing that ever happened to me." "Second best thing that happened to me," Kyle corrected. "The best thing was you saying yes." They made love with the slow tenderness of long practice, knowing exactly how to touch and please each other. And afterward they fell asleep wrapped around each other the way they had every night for 25 years. Outside, the desert night was cool and quiet, and inside, all was peace and contentment and love. More years passed, bringing joy and sorrow in the measure that all lives contain. They buried old friends and welcomed new babies. They watched Clifton Hill transform from a rough mining town into a proper city with telephone lines and electric lights. They adapted to changes while maintaining the core of who they were and what they had built together. James married a rancher's daughter and took over the flower shop completely when Kyle and Hannah finally decided to retire. Rose moved to San Francisco to pursue her art but came home often, never losing her connection to the desert and the family she loved. Kyle and Hannah became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their legacy expand in ways they had never imagined. They spent their retirement traveling more, visiting Rose in California and exploring the country that had changed so much since they were young. But they always came home to Clifton Hill, to the little house with its garden full of flowers, to the town that had given them everything that mattered. On a warm spring morning in 1920, Kyle woke to find Hannah still sleeping beside him, peaceful and quiet. He watched her for a long moment, drinking in the sight of her face that he had loved for more than 35 years, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had shared. When she didn't wake at her usual time, when he couldn't rouse her no matter how gently he tried, he understood with a grief that went bone deep that she was gone. The funeral was enormous, with people coming from all over Arizona to pay their respects to the woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness and her flowers. The shop closed for a week, and James made sure the church was filled with every type of bloom his mother had loved, creating a display so beautiful that people wept just looking at it. Kyle spoke at the service, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. He told the story of how they had met, how he had bought flowers every week for months before he finally gave them to the woman who sold them. He talked about the life they had built together, the love that had sustained them through every challenge and every triumph. He thanked Hannah for choosing him, for seeing something worth loving in a drifter with no roots and no prospects, for being his partner and his love and the best part of his life for 35 years. "She made me better than I was," Kyle said, looking out at the sea of faces, seeing their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, seeing the town full of people whose lives Hannah had touched. "She made me want to be worthy of her love, and I spent every day of our marriage trying to live up to that standard. I don't know if I ever quite managed it, but I never stopped trying, and I never will." Kyle lived for 5 more years, staying in the house they had shared, tending the garden that Hannah had loved, visiting the flower shop that James ran with the same care and dedication that his parents had modeled. He spent time with his family, telling stories about Hannah to the great-grandchildren who had never known her, making sure her memory stayed alive and vital. He carved more in those final years, creating an entire set of wooden flowers that would never wilt or fade, giving one to each of his descendants, so they would always have something to remember him and Hannah by. He wrote down the story of their lives together, wanting future generations to know how a simple transaction over roses had turned into the greatest love story he could imagine. On a Saturday morning in 1925, Kyle bought flowers from James at the shop, maintaining the ritual that had become sacred to him, He took them to the cemetery where Hannah was buried beneath a headstone carved with roses, and he sat beside her grave like he did every week, talking to her about their children and grandchildren, about the town they had loved, about how much he missed her, and how ready he was to be with her again. That night, Kyle died peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Hannah for 35 years, holding the locket she had given him with the portraits of their children inside. James found him in the morning and wept even as he recognized the small smile on his father's face, the look of someone who had lived a full life and was content with how it had ended. They buried Kyle beside Hannah, and the whole town turned out again. 3 generations of people whose lives had been shaped by the couple who had built a flower shop and a family, and a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. James made sure his father's casket was covered in roses, the same type Kyle had bought that very first day, closing the circle of their story. The flower shop remained in the family for generations, passed down through children and grandchildren, always maintaining the traditions that Kyle and Hannah had established. Every person who ran it bought flowers for themselves every Saturday, remembering the ritual that had started it all. The wooden flowers that Kyle had carved were treasured and protected, displayed in homes throughout Clifton Hill and beyond, as reminders of the love that had created them. And sometimes, on quiet Saturday mornings when the light came through the windows just right, people swore they could see 2 figures standing in the shop, a tall man with kind eyes and a woman with honey-colored eyes, their hands intertwined, surrounded by flowers and love and the proof that some things, when built with care and dedication and genuine affection, really do last forever. The story of the cowboy who bought flowers every week and finally gave them to the woman selling them became legend in Clifton Hill, told and retold to each new generation as an example of how love should be. Patient, persistent, and willing to grow from the smallest beginnings into something strong enough to weather any storm. It was a reminder that the most important things in life often start with simple gestures, that showing up consistently matters more than grand gestures, and that sometimes the thing you've been searching for has been right in front of you all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to reach for it. Kyle and Hannah's love story didn't end with their deaths. It lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the flower shop that still stood on the same corner, in the traditions they had established and the values they had modeled. It lived on in the roses that still grew in the garden of the little house, descendants of the very first blooms Hannah had cultivated. It lived on in the stories people told, in the example they had set, in the proof they had provided that true love, the kind that lasts, is built through daily choice and commitment and the willingness to see and value another person completely. And every spring, when the desert bloomed in defiance of the harsh climate, when wildflowers and roses opened their petals to the sun, people in Clifton Hill remembered the woman who had sold flowers from a street corner and the cowboy who had bought them every week until he finally gave them to her, along with his heart, his future, and every Saturday for the rest of his life.